My stepdaughter erased me from her wedding. After I paid $235,000 over 17 years, I canceled everything in 24 hours. And her millionaire fiancé left when her real dad couldn't pay a single dollar. I'm 52 years old. I work in financial consulting, and the truth is, I need to tell this story because what happened a few months ago still has me processing everything. You know, trying to understand how the hell I got to this point. Basically, I dedicated 17 years of my life to a family that erased me from existence when it mattered most. And I guess part of me needs to hear that I'm not crazy for the way I reacted. The thing is, I met Melissa when I was like 35 years old. She had just gotten out of a complicated divorce and had a daughter, Natalie, who at the time was 9 years old. The biological father, Scott Wallace, was basically a ghost. I mean, he'd show up every 2 months to take her out for pizza and then disappear for another 3 months without paying child support or anything, like the classic dad who promises everything and delivers nothing. Melissa didn't work. She lived off what her mom gave her and some part-time jobs she'd get here and there, but nothing stable. When we started dating, I already had my career established. I was making good money, and I don't know. I fell in love with both of them somehow. You know what I mean? Natalie was a sweet kid who needed stability, and Melissa was charming when she wanted to be. We moved in together after a year of dating, and I basically took on the father role from day one. I paid for everything, and when I say everything, it's everything. The rent, the food, Natalie's activities, her piano lessons, her private school that cost like $25,000 a year because Melissa insisted her daughter deserved the best. And, of course, I agreed. Don't get me wrong, I wanted to give Natalie the opportunities that Scott clearly wasn't going to give her. The years went by and I kept being the one signing the checks, the one going to parent-teacher conferences because Melissa was always busy with who knows what, the one helping with math homework until midnight when Natalie had exams. Scott kept showing up occasionally, like twice a year, for birthday and Christmas with some generic gift he bought at the last minute, and Natalie adored him every time he appeared, which hurt me, but I understood it. I guess because at the end of the day he was her biological dad, and I was just her mom's boyfriend who paid the bills. When Natalie turned 18 and was accepted into a pretty expensive university on the East Coast, guess who paid the full tuition? $90,000 over 4 years, not counting housing expenses, books, and the money I'd send her monthly so she wouldn't have to work and could focus on her studies. Melissa would tell me it was an investment in Natalie's future, that someday she would thank us, and I believed it because, honestly, I wanted to believe it. During those college years, Scott would call Natalie like once every 3 months, but she always talked about him like he was this incredible father who was super busy with his work or whatever. She never mentioned that I was the one literally financing her entire life. When she graduated, I bought her a Mercedes-Benz. Not a brand new one, but a recent model that cost like $45,000 because Melissa insisted she needed a safe car for her new job in the city. Scott sent a congratulations card. A fucking card. Things continued like this until about 2 years ago when Natalie, who was already 26, met Nicholas at some finance conference or something. Nicholas comes from a pretty wealthy family. His parents, Ruth and Stephen, have a real estate company or something like that, and from the beginning I could see that Melissa was super excited about this relationship because, well, finally her daughter was going to marry someone with money. Nicholas seemed like a good guy, honestly, hardworking and polite, and after a year and a half of dating, he proposed to her on a trip to Europe that I helped pay for, partially because Natalie didn't have enough savings. When they announced the engagement, I was genuinely happy for her. I thought that finally we were going to be a real family, that maybe at the wedding they'd give me some special role or at least some recognition for everything I'd done for almost 2 decades. But then the wedding planning started, and I basically didn't exist. Melissa and Natalie had these planning sessions that I wasn't invited to. They'd go try cakes and flowers and dresses, and when I'd ask how things were going, Melissa would say something vague like everything was fine and change the subject. The wedding was going to be huge, like 350 guests at an expensive vineyard outside the city, and every time I asked about costs, Melissa would tell me not to worry, that Nicholas and his family were going to help. But then bills started arriving in my email. Deposits for the venue, the catering, the photographer, and I realized they basically expected me to pay for most of everything without even asking me first. I tried to talk to Melissa about this, and she got super defensive, told me it was my responsibility as Natalie's father to contribute to her wedding. And I reminded her that technically, I wasn't her father because we never got married and I never legally adopted her. But she just looked at me like I was a monster for even mentioning that. One day, the printed invitations arrived at the house, and Melissa was super excited, showing me how elegant they turned out. I took them and started reading them, and there it was, in big gold letters. Scott, Wallace, and Melissa invite you to the wedding of their daughter, Natalie. My name didn't appear anywhere. I asked Melissa what the hell this was, and she got nervous, told me that Natalie had decided it was more traditional to put only the names of the biological parents, that it wasn't anything personal. Nothing personal? I said. Melissa, I've paid for everything for 17 years. The school, the university, the car, this fucking wedding, and my name doesn't even appear? She started crying and told me that was ruining Natalie's special moment with my ego, that I should be happy that she was happy, and I stood there with the invitation in my hand feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. But things got worse. Much worse. Like 2 weeks later, Natalie organized a dinner at a super exclusive restaurant downtown, one of those places where you need a reservation months in advance and where a bottle of wine costs what a normal person spends on food in a week. It was a dinner to formally introduce both families, Nicholas's parents, Ruth and Stephen, and on Natalie's side there was Melissa, me, and surprise, surprise, Scott Wallace. When I arrived at the restaurant and saw Scott sitting there with a beer in his hand, acting like he was Father of the Year, I wanted to turn around and leave, but Melissa grabbed my arm and whispered for me to behave. We sat down and the whole dinner was basically a show where Natalie and Melissa acted like Scott was this present and involved Father, Ruth, and Stephen asking him questions about his relationship with Natalie, and him making up stories about all the important moments they shared, and moments where I know perfectly well he wasn't there, because I was there. The dinner ended and I thought we could finally leave, but then Natalie stood up and said she wanted to make a toast. She raised her glass and started talking about how grateful she was to have everyone there, about how excited she was to marry Nicholas, and then, and this is what completely destroyed me, she turned to Scott and said, I want to especially thank my dad, Scott, for being my rock, my whole life, for always being there for me no matter what, and for agreeing to walk me down the aisle on the most important day of my life. Everyone toasted and applauded while I sat there, feeling like I was having a heart attack. Melissa touched my leg under the table like telling me to calm down, but I was already beyond the point of calming down. I waited for Natalie to sit down, stood up, and said loud and clear for everyone to hear, Well, Scott, since you're her rock and you're going to walk her down the aisle, I guess you can also pay for the wedding. And before anyone could react, I took out my wallet, threw like $300 on the table to cover my part of the dinner, and walked out of the restaurant. Melissa got home like 2 hours later, furious, yelling that I had ruined everything, that I had humiliated Natalie in front of Nicholas's family, that I was selfish and immature. I told her that what was selfish was expecting me to pay for everything and then completely erase me from the equation, that I wasn't a fucking ATM they could use when it was convenient. She told me that Natalie saw me as a father, that she only put Scott on the invitation for tradition, that I was overreacting. I asked her, if she sees me as a father, then why is her biological father, who hasn't done anything for her in 17 years, going to walk her down the aisle and not me? And Melissa had no answer for that. She just kept repeating that I was being dramatic. I told her it was over, that I wasn't going to pay another dollar for that wedding, and she looked at me like I was crazy and told me I couldn't do that we'd already given deposits, that people had already received the invitations. I called the wedding venue and canceled the contract. I lost the $15,000 deposit, but I saved the other $80,000 that were left to pay. I called the catering. Canceled. Photographer. Canceled. DJ. Florist. Cake. Everything canceled. I went to the bank, took out all the money from the joint savings account I had with Melissa, like $120,000, that was mine anyway because she never worked, and transferred it to a new account in my name only. Then I went to where Natalie lived with Nicholas. She wasn't there, so I talked to the security guard and told him I was there to pick up the Mercedes because it needed service. He let me take it without a problem. I took it to a dealer and sold it that same day for $50,000. Cash. I went back home and waited. Natalie started texting me around 3 in the afternoon. First, they were confused, asking why vendors were contacting her about cancellations. Then they were frantic, with capital letters, exclamation points, telling me I was ruining her life. How could I do this to her? I responded with one message, told her to ask her dad Scott if he could help her with the vendors, and then I blocked her. Melissa got home that night and exploded, told me I was a monster, that Natalie was devastated, that Nicholas was considering ending the engagement because his family thought we were all crazy. I told her very calmly that if Scott was so important to Natalie, then he could be the one to pay for her wedding, that I had already done my part for 17 years and never even got a thank you. She tried to cry, to manipulate me with how I was, the only real father figure Natalie had ever had, but I was already tired of that argument. I told her that if I was so important, then why wasn't my name on the invitation? Why wasn't I going to walk her down the aisle? Why did Scott get all the credit? She had no answer. The next few days were absolute chaos. Scott called me. I didn't block him because I wanted to hear what he had to say, and he basically tried to convince me to let this all go, that Natalie was just a confused kid, that I was the adult and should be the more mature one. I told him that Natalie was 26 years old and old enough to make her own decisions, and that if she decided he was her father, then he could act like it and open his wallet. He started stuttering something about being between jobs and not having much money at the moment, and I laughed and told him that was typical of him. To show up only when it was convenient and disappear when it was time to make a real effort. He got angry and told me I was being vindictive and cruel, and I told him that what was cruel was raising a kid for 17 years, paying for absolutely everything, and then being treated like you're invisible. I hung up. Natalie showed up at my house a few days later. Melissa had obviously given her her key. She was crying, saying she was so sorry, that she hadn't thought about how I felt, that she just wanted her biological father to have a role in her wedding because he'd never been present and this was his chance to be part of something important in her life. I told her, Natalie, you have every right to want that, but you can't have both things. You can't want Scott to be your dad for the photos and the nice moments, and me to be your dad for paying the bills. I asked her directly, if I had died 5 years ago, do you think Scott would have paid for your university, your car, this wedding? She said nothing, just kept crying. I told her to give me one reason, just one reason, why I should pay $100,000 for a wedding where my name doesn't appear anywhere, where I don't have any role, where I'm basically just another guest who casually financed your entire life. She tried to say something about how I was important to her, but I was already tired of empty words. I told her to leave. Melissa sent Natalie back with a handwritten letter, all dramatic, where Natalie apologized for not valuing me, for taking me for granted, for not including me as I deserved. It said she wanted me to walk her down the aisle along with Scott, that she was going to change the invitations, that I was her real father in all the ways that mattered. I read the letter and threw it in the trash. Not because I didn't believe she meant it, but because I realized she only meant it now that the money was gone. That if I had kept paying for everything without complaining, she would never have questioned her decision to give Scott all the credit. I told Melissa to tell Natalie that I appreciated the ST apology, but my decision was final. That Scott could pay for the wedding, or they could do something smaller with Nicholas's family's money, but that I wasn't going to contribute another penny. The wedding was officially canceled like 2 weeks later. Turns out Nicholas's family, despite having money, wasn't willing to pay for a 350-person wedding for a family that obviously had serious internal problems. Nicholas told Natalie they could get married in something small or wait until they had their own money. But Natalie was so devastated by all the drama that she told him she needed time, and they basically put the engagement on pause. Melissa blamed me for ruining her daughter's relationship. I told her I didn't ruin anything, that Natalie's actions had consequences, and that sometimes in life, you can't have everything you want without considering other people's feelings. Melissa packed her things and went to live with her mom about a month after all this. We started the divorce process. Or, well, technically, It wasn't divorce because we never legally got married, but we had to divide some things. Luckily, I was always careful about keeping my finances separate, and she never worked, so she had no legal right to my money or properties. About 3 months ago, I blocked them all, changed the locks on the house, and basically started my life over. I'm 52 years old and I'm single for the first time in almost 2 decades, which is weird but also liberating somehow. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, if I should have been the bigger person and forgiven and paid for the wedding anyway. But then I remember how I felt reading that invitation, hearing that toast, being treated like my 17 years of sacrifice meant nothing, and I know I made the right decision. I don't regret it. Natalie and Nicholas apparently got back together recently and are planning a small courthouse wedding with just immediate family. And no, I'm not invited, which is fine because I wouldn't go anyway. Money I saved from not paying for the wedding, I invested in remodeling my house and a trip to Europe I always wanted to take, but never could because I was always paying for other people's things. Scott still hasn't contributed a single dollar to anything from what I heard. Surprise, surprise. And that's it, I guess. Sometimes you realize that people only value you for what you can do for them, and when you stop doing it, you realize who actually cared about you. In my case, the answer was nobody.